I first need to begin with a confession of sorts. When I was reading your book, Costica, I often found myself laughing. There are so many comic moments in the book. I think they're mostly unintended or unwitting. They're often tragic or pathetic, but they are funny. I think of Simone Weil shouldering a rifle that she couldn't shoot straight, or stepping into a vat of boiling grease, which happened to save her life. I think of Gandhi counting out the exact number of raisins he would have for breakfast, or discussing his bowel movements with the other residents of his ashram, while trying to orchestrate the independence of India. I think of Cioran sponging off of bourgeois Parisians while perfecting his art of doing nothing. I think of Mishima urging these Japanese soldiers to follow him in overthrowing the government, and all the while they're mocking him as a moron. And so I'm wondering, was I wrong to laugh at these scenes?
No, it's they are planned. Those moments you mentioned are part of the plan. When you write a book this dark, you really need to have such moments, because otherwise you lose your readers. Otherwise, so you needed some kind of balance. Some of the best, comedies are black comedies. You need humor precisely at those particular moments, and so I kind of exactly. I'm glad you spotted them, and it means they are there for a reason. I could have easily, because they're trifles, right? The raisins, but there I mentioned I wanted to bring a smile on people on the reader's face as they went through that dark place, which is the book eventually.
Okay, well, why don't we turn to some of these thinkers? In your prologue, you propose that failure has 4 dimensions, or rings, as you call them. There's the physical, there's the political, the social, and finally the biological. And each of these is wider, is deeper than the preceding one. And then you take up these rings in 4 chapters, each of which toggles between a thinker and either another thinker or a school of thought. And at first glance, they seem to have very little or nothing to do with one another. And this is a remarkable to and fro. It generates all sorts of wonderful and surprising insights. So why don't we begin with Simone Weil, and about what you diagnose as her guilt for being not just clumsy, but for simply being, as an exemplar of physical failure. Why is this so? How did it shape her thought? Which, as you go on to argue, I'm not sure you make the argument, as you suggest, resembles the thought of the medieval Christian sect, the Cathars in southwestern France.
She's such an interesting case. When it comes, well, she's interesting in all respects and in so many ways, but when it comes to her relationship to the Cathars, because she had been I would say, a Cathar from the beginning, for forever, her contempt for flesh, for eating, for body, for everything that had to do with body, and she was such a profoundly, dualistic personality. But of course, she was widely read. She was read in classics, and she knew everything. But as it happened, she knew about Cathars very little about Cathars. We know from her friend. Simone Petremont, who was her friend and later biographer, Simone mentioned that in a note. Look, actually, she didn't know much about it. She knew, just as I was saying, she knew quite a bit about everything. But as far as Gnosticism was concerned, her knowledge was very limited. However, she was herself agnostic. In many ways, she had a profound agnostic soul, and more specifically, Catherine in many ways. And that becomes clearer and clearer as she approaches her own end. Right before she left France for the United States, she spent some time in Marseille and the whole area of southern France where Cathars, medieval Cathars used to live, and she got in touch with some of the Cathar scholars of Catharism, or aficionado. And they're not just scholars; they're very passionate about Catharism. And she discovered herself there, which is it's natural, of course, considering what we know, everything we know about her. And then she goes on to practice starvation, to neglect her body, to see it as some kind of burden, as some kind of well, she doesn't go as far as to say the body has been created by some evil god, but comes close, and so has a complicated relationship with both with Catharism, but also with the Catholic Church, which she was courting. She came very close to getting baptized, but she never did because she had reservations, including the Catholic Church's relationship to heresies, particularly Catharism. She's fascinating, and she would, as you say, those stories, I had to, for reasons of composition, let's say reasons of composition, I needed to have in every single one of those chapters kind of a figure, right, an actual person, to flesh out the ideas discussed there, the more theoretical ideas that I tackle with, but also to function as a mirror of sorts. You have two types of texts, and they mirror each other, and there's this secret communication between those. I wanted to make sure that it's not a mechanical relationship, like, you have one theoretical point and next you have some kind of illustration. That would have been too banal, formulaic or whatever. But there's a secret connection or some kind of commerce between those two layers of text, and which keeps going. Sometimes it can be quite tight, and because you really get to see a strict connection. Could be a matter of mirroring, of illustration, but very often it's just some kind of remote echo, and some kind of echo is a good word, I guess, in many cases. So that would work virtually for every single chapter. You have Simone Weil there. You have, in the next one is Gandhi and the world of politics and political failure. Then in the third one is Cioran and social failure. And finally, the fourth chapter is a bit more complicated. There are more people there, and they keep dying. But it's you see it's the same. You have Seneca, which is part of the first layer, and also you have Mishima, of course, but also somebody like Dazai, some kind of real rival to Mishima's, and a number of people, or Honorary, friend, the philosopher. It was meant to make, again, the one reason was composition. I needed some kind of counterpoint, some kind of echo, but also it's beyond that. It's a matter of making the whole project more relatable, to show that it's failure and all that's in the book is about humans in flesh and blood. It's something that concerns every single one of us. It's not just in books, it's the stuff of philosophy books. It's something that happens in real life. It happens all the time. It's happened, and by finding out about those people, their stories and so on, you get to understand yourself better as a reader, as somebody who is just interested in the topic.
When this method of composition, of course, what it implies is that certain material is included and yet other material is excluded. So you devote a great deal of attention, and I think that's the proper word, to Weil's desire for what she calls decreation. But I think Iris Murdoch, one of her admirers, is more on the mark when she calls it unselfing. But I wonder if this occludes or obscures other facets to Weil's life and to her writing that are no less important and perhaps not nearly as dark, Costica. I think about what she calls luminous moments, for example, in her essay on the Iliad, the poem of Force, her preoccupation with justice and love and friendship when we unite with a friend or family, a lover, or our own soul. I mean, do these things figure in a philosophy of failure?
Remember, I had to make a selection. You have to arrange things in a certain way. You work like a I guess like a filmmaker, and you have a lot of of material. You lots of hours and hours of shooting, and eventually, and I went there, as you mentioned. I studied her her case quite a bit, but then when you get to the point where you're to decide what goes in and what's left out, you have to make a selection. And because Weil is just one chapter, I had to have many others, and then there has to be a balance between different. But also I use those things about the creation and her clumsiness and so on, work experience, factory experience and so on, to those things work better for the story I was telling. It would have been, of course, what you are saying is perfectly legitimate, and they should be covered. But I would guess in a book on Weil, as you did excellently in your own book on Simone Weil. So kind of, because she was only one actor, one player there. There will be others. I had to be
selective,
quite selective. Yeah.
Right, but it's funny. I mean, Orson Welles, I think, once said, if you want a happy ending, well, that depends on where you end the movie. But in your case, it's almost as if you want an unhappy ending, it depends on where you end the movie. And they're both equally legitimate, equally insightful, equally probing and provocative. And this is the case as well with your treatment of Gandhi. You note the irony of how the actions of this world-famous exponent of nonviolent resistance led to what you call the resounding failure of the subcontinent's partition, one that unfolds in this unbelievable paroxysm of bloody violence. And you go on to make the case that the subtitle to his autobiography, which is My Experiments with the Truth, should instead have been My Experiments with Failure. And so I wonder if you can talk a bit about this.
Right. He was such an attractive case for the purposes of this book, because here he is almost saint, right? He's Mahatma, the great soul. Really, he's a saintly figure. No matter how you look at it, he was revered in his lifetime as a saint. He has been ever since in kind of religious terms, as some kind of messianic form. And that's precisely why I went after him, because to find, failure, sometimes major failures in such a figure would be interesting. I mean, I'm not saying, not in a cheap journalistic way, I got you, but in a more human way, in a more profound way. It's he was one of the best. He went as far as anybody could go on the way to perfection. He did all he could. He was really an exceptional individual, and practiced, in his life what he preached and so on. He's such an incredible teacher and practitioner of virtue. And yet you see all that failure in different forms, personal and collective, and the failure that originates from his ideas, failure that he's guilty of, failure that he did not address and he should have. And it was kind of that gives you a sense of our humanity, because you wonder if such an individual cannot escape failure and remains, entangled in failure, what can we do? I mean, I would guess his story would teach us something important about perfection, and we need to be, to improve ourselves, to strive to be better human beings. But at the same time, we have to be realistic, and there's only that much that we can do, and there are limits. And of course, he performs in the chapter of political failure, and whatever happened to him personally is interesting, but even more interesting, more relevant is what he did practically in his public life, in his career. And that's even more interesting. For example, his attempt at an utopia, which came to null. I mean, it's a very interesting, it's sometimes juicy. It's such a spectacular failure, that ashram. Because he wanted to experiment. What he wanted there was a kind of the future of India on a small scale, in view of kind of replicating and expanding it on a much larger scale. And if it failed on such a small scale, and we know it did because we have so many stories coming from people who live there with him, that should make us cautious when it comes to utopia in general. And that's why, on the other hand, in that same chapter, I discuss the French Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution and other forms of other utopian projects, which failed again because of our hubris, because we don't know. We think that we tend to think that if we have the right idea, the right dreams, the right ideas, that's enough. All we have to do is just go on and put them into practice. But that can be disastrous if we are not careful, and if we don't pay attention to other things, like what my fellow human beings is doing. My attempt to put that into practice, doesn't that affect doesn't that affect negatively the people flesh and blood around me? So you have that situation in Soviet Russia, for example, where in the name of this perfect society, really wonderful society, millions of people were killed, millions of lives were destroyed, and large proportions of the population were shipped overnight to Siberia and destroyed and so on. So utopia is important. It's really one of the greatest topics we have in politics and in humanities and so on. But we have to approach it really carefully, because it can easily turn into its opposite. It can be a hell.
What strikes me is you mentioned Robespierre, and you devote a few pages to him in this chapter. And of course, it was his Committee of Public Safety that in 1793 announced that terror is the order of the day. And as you were speaking, I was wondering if, in a way, in Gandhi's ashram, he was also, of course, he wasn't going as far as saying that terror was the order of the day. But when I think about that incident that George Orwell discusses in his review of Gandhi's autobiography, where Gandhi confesses to having refused on 3 separate occasions the giving of meat-based protein to either his wife or to one of his children who were extremely ill, and the doctors prescribed basically chicken broth, and he said no. And there is something terrifying about that. Fortunately, Gandhi was ignored, and the children were given chicken broth or the equivalent. And I can't help but think of Orwell's remark that there was something profoundly inhuman about Gandhi, and that humanity is more or less on this side of chicken broth than on the side that
not only chicken broth. It was sometimes very often he would be against medication, like modern medicine, medications, that was cruel. It was the case of his wife who was dying, and he opposed any form of artificial drugs. He could be a very, very special person.
When we get to chapter 4, to the fourth and the widest of rings, biological failure, which is also known as death, you quote Jankelevich and his claim that to think death is to think the unthinkable, but you nevertheless do think about death, or rather you circle around the subject of death, trying to catch it unawares, a bit like Antonius Bloch in Bergman's The Seventh Seal, which you also discuss in this marvelous chapter. And so I wonder, in what way can we, the living, learn from the death of Mishima, or what you would call ultimate biological failure? Is this what we call at the Academy a teaching moment for readers or students, or what do we do with it?
Good question. I guess if there is a teaching moment, it's rather negative. We learn how not to. There is I tend to circle around a lot in that final chapter, precisely because I do not have a clear answer, and more importantly, because I'm not sure if there is such a thing as an answer that applies to everybody, and everybody can learn from it and then apply into their lives. It's a matter that it's something that each one of us has to come to terms with. Each one of us has to design our own death and way of coping with our finitude and so on. That's precisely why I was reluctant to propose some specific teaching guidelines or whatever. So I tried to show. So it was mostly by showing Seneca, right? His complicated life and relationship with life and death, and some of his philosophy, and he prepared for all his life. He prepared to die, and then when that happened, it went wrong. It's such a strange irony. He was one of those in the tradition, the philosophical tradition, that to die is to learn how to philosophize is
to learn how to die.
And then when it comes, so he would really preach that, and he would be trying to illustrate that. So all his much of his work is there. And when it comes to dying, he stumbled. He had so many issues, but nevertheless, he succeeded in a way. He cut a brave fear. And then you have different, you have Mishima's, which was a kind of very theatrical. It's a little more mockery. There's a huge anxiety there to when it comes to facing that. In Mishima, he thought that by that production, right, the theatrical production that he staged, he would sometime master his own ending, which we don't know. It's something that happened to him and him only, and only he would know. And then you have Dazai and others. It remains our the biggest mystery, right? I'm not going. That's why I can't really say. And I would go back to Yankelevich. It's the unthinkable, and we try a different way. We improvise. We imagine. We circle around, but eventually we don't really know before we get there.
No, we don't. One last question before we turn to those that they're piling up from the audience. It's about one of your concluding remarks, though it's actually in one of the earlier chapters, Costica. It has to do with the tie between the leitmotif in your chapters, namely humility, and the tie between humility and democracy. It's a beautiful passage, and let me read it. Democracy fails when it doesn't make enough room for failure, when people can't help seeing themselves as better than they really are, which is most of the time. The question I want to leave with you is it possible for these powerful insights to have much traction in an age consumed by politics as spectacle, a spectacle that's multiplied infinitely by our social media and by the ubiquity of our flat screens? Is there really a future for humility in our democracy?
Well,
I'm sorry.
I'm pessimistic, as you could tell. I tend to be quite pessimistic for personal reasons, for other reasons. So I really think the solution eventually is individual. It's a matter of personal choice and lifestyle, and humanity is. Yeah, as you mentioned, as I try to make the case in the book, it's when it comes to collective skill. To be practiced on a collective scale, it's almost impossible. It's just, we need to strive, I guess. We need to aspire. But when it comes to turning it into an institution, it's almost impossible. We have this dream of ancient democracy, but that failed as well. But humanity as such can be practiced, can be embodied personally on a personal level, because we have Buddhist monks, and we have ascetics, and we have very humble, very brave people who understood, and who turned to humanity as a major existential choice in their lives, and that's the only hope.